2 or 3. Oh. 2 or 3. Take a look. God damn. Could you imagine pitching that helm around for 3 hours and then in a span of like 20 minutes, your whole fleet gets fucking clapped, bro?
Inside Hiryu's ready room was Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi. He was the airstrike leader that had just battered Midway. He and his fellow airmen were resting when suddenly a pilot walked in and shouted, "The Akagi's damaged! The Soryu and Kaga are burning! We're the only ship that hasn't been hit!" Tomonaga and the men made their way to the decks to see what was going on. And one can only imagine the shock and horror on the pilots' faces as they saw their fellow sister ships burning fiercely on the horizon. Revenge had to be taken. Some sort of retribution had to be delivered.
Lucas J, thank you for gifting a sub. Got that cool, tactical music.
Rear Admiral Yamaguchi now found himself in command of the only operational carrier left in the Kido Butai. Despite the tragedy that had just befallen them, and the grim odds stacked against them, only one viable option remained in the eyes of the Japanese: to strike back. This is the Battle of Midway Part 2, Hiryu's counterstrike.
No way. This shit
Yamaguchi wasted no time sending the retaliatory strike.
Anything, right?
Led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, the strike consisted of a complete squadron of 18 dive bombers with 6 fighters as escorts. They took off at 10:54. Much was expected from this group as they were all piloted by seasoned veterans and considered by many to be an elite unit. Lifting the fog of war, we can now see that the Americans had 3 carriers with them, operating in 2 separate task forces. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was in overall command. He was a cautious yet prudent commander who had a wealth of
dude, I'd say it is this picture, dude.
Combat experience.
Dude, it looks like he was standing there for 20 minutes and instructed to look at like a thing on the wall. For 20 minutes and he got caught by surprise.
He had previously fought the Japanese a month earlier at Coral Sea. Task Force 17 was under Fletcher's direct command, and it was centered on his flagship, the USS Yorktown. Sole survivor of Coral Sea, the damaged Yorktown had been quickly patched up and made battle-worthy in just 2 days so that she could participate in the battle.
2 days?
It had been her dive bombers that had shattered the Soryu.
Fletcher
also had operational command of Task Force 16, which was led by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Task Force 16 contained the Hornet and the Enterprise. And it had been Enterprise's dive bombers that had taken out the Kaga and the Akagi.
Could you imagine how fucking amazing it would feel to be the crew on any of these carriers after that result? Could you imagine? Holy shit.
All 3 carriers were waiting anxiously for the return of their strike groups, and unfortunately for the Yorktown, she would be receiving some unwanted visitors as well. Kobayashi was heading her way.
Bosh,
Contrary to belief,
why wouldn't I just watch the
Nagumo was
video?
not a broken man. After the disaster at 10:30, his reaction was quite defiant. After shifting his flag from the Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, he ordered the Kido Butai towards the enemy, who were now believed to be only 90 miles away.
He made it out of the ship and is on another ship?
Optimistically believed he could engage the Americans in a daylight surface action. However, this fanciful notion was shattered when at 12:40, reports showed the American forces were heading east and opening the distance. He subsequently changed course as well and began to head northeast.
Wait, why? Is he retreating?
At 10:50, Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and chief architect of the whole operation, was notified of the current situation of Nagumo's mobile force. One can envision his sorrow and dismay upon hearing the news that 3 of his carriers were on fire. Just like Nagumo, he too was hopeful that a surface engagement could be forced upon the Americans. At 12:20, he issued a series of orders to retrieve the situation. He ordered a concentration of his main warships to come to Nagumo's aid. In terms of air support, Yamamoto ordered the carriers Junyo and Ryujo, operating in the Aleutian campaign, to head south to join the Hiryu. There was just a problem though. All friendly forces were hundreds of miles away. Both Yamamoto with his main body of battleships and Admiral Kondo with his 2 fast battleships could arrive no sooner than the following morning. And the 2 carriers, forget about it. They were over 2 days away.
Wait. The following morning? I thought it was noon. It would take them 13 hours to travel 200 miles? How many miles per hour is that? So 10 is Jesus! These things go slow.
But ultimately, this effort didn't really matter because the Americans had no intention whatsoever of participating in a surface battle. They were heading east, away from the Japanese. So it was up to the Hiryu, with her meager air power alone, to take on the enemy.
LA traffic.
En route to the reported location, the Japanese air group encountered a group of stragglers returning to their carriers. The 6-0s apparently couldn't resist such a tempting target, and eager for revenge, broke ranks to attack them.
Oh no.
This turned out to be a foolish move. The aircraft were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, who now without their bombs proved to be very agile and maneuverable. A sharp clash ensued, and although no planes were lost on either side, 2 Zeros were severely damaged that they had to return to their carriers.
Oh my god.
The Val dive bombers now had only 4 escorting fighters and they were miles behind. This unnecessary
what the fuck, bro?
Skirmish would prove to be a fatal mistake. At 11:52, radar detected the Japanese strike 32 miles out. Yorktown had 8 fighters in the air and the majority went in to intercept the strike formation. With their fighter escorts still too far behind to intervene, the attack proved devastating for the vulnerable dive bombers. The dive bombing formation was completely shattered and disorganized. 7 Vals were shot out of the sky before the Zeros finally made an appearance, but even then, they only managed to shoot down 1 Wildcat before losing 3 of their own. During this engagement, 2 additional Vals were destroyed and another 2 had to jettison their bombs, which meant it was now up to only 7 dive bombers to eliminate a carrier. The bombers decided to split into 2 divisions to attack the Yorktown. The first would attack directly from the west, while the other 4 would attack from the southwest, so that they could approach with the sun to their backs. Kobayashi's unit was reputed to be the best dive bombing squadron in the fleet, and they would soon confirm their elite status. The attack began at 12:10. The first plane was shot down, but his aim was true, striking the Yorktown abaft the number 2 elevator.
Oof.
The second got a near miss, starting a minor fire on the fantail. The third and fourth missed their mark as the Yorktown was turning to port to throw off their aim. But the 5th bomber landed the most damaging blow. It exploded deep inside her hull, damaging the stack uptakes and snuffing out all but one of her boilers. Thick smoke began to gush out and Yorktown's speed dropped. Then, another heavy hit was scored, knocking out her forward elevator and starting several fires deep in her hull.
I wouldn't know.
The attack concluded with the final plane scoring a near miss. 4 minutes after the attack, the Yorktown came to a halt and was dead in the water, with heavy fires on board. The carrier was out of operation.
But did it sink, though?
This picture shows the dive bombing attack in the initial stages. Notice the damaged dive bomber about to crash into the water. Its tail has been completely shot off. The dives conducted by Kobayashi's unit were nearly vertical and were held steady despite the intense anti-aircraft fire the Americans had put up. Hitting a moving target cruising at 30 knots was no small feat, and the result speaks for itself.
What is 30 knots?
3 hits and 2 damaged near misses from 7 aircraft? It had been a spectacular performance, one that even the Americans begrudgingly acknowledged.
34 miles per hour. Okay, that's not very slow. For a thing that big, that's actually kind of fast.
Kobayashi was not amongst the survivors, but he would have been proud of his unit for this impressive achievement.
71%.
However, the attack had suffered intolerable losses. Only 5 of the 18 Vals made it back. That's a 72% loss rate. And of the remaining escorts, only 1 of the 4 Zeros made it home. If the Japanese continued like this, they wouldn't have any more attack aircraft left by the evening. In return for all this damage, the Americans had lost only 1 Wildcat.
Oh.
The survivors enthusiastically reported to Yamaguchi that they had left a carrier dead in the water and burning fiercely. By this point, the Japanese knew they were facing 3 carriers, and according to their scorecard, if one had been taken out, it meant that it was now 1 versus 2. The battle could still be won, although a considerable amount of luck would be needed.
How could it be won? We did it, Copium. How?
The second strike prepared for their launch. Unfortunately for Yamaguchi, Hiryu's carrier attack unit had been the one that had suffered the most losses on the Midway strike. So instead of the regular complement of 18 torpedo planes, only 10 Kates were available for the attack. The strike was to be led by Lieutenant Tomonaga. Earlier, his plane had suffered a hit, and although it had been patched up, it kept leaking fuel, meaning he might not have enough fuel to return. Other pilots pleaded to switch planes with him, but Tomonaga refused. With a touch of humor, he told them that the Yankees were only 90 miles away, and that he could make it there and back on a single tank of gas. At 13:31, the strike took off along with its escort of 6 fighters.
They're throwing out slurs.
Before their departure, Yamaguchi had reminded his pilots, there's 2 undamaged carriers left. Your mission is to take out one of them.
Why?
It was imperative that this strike destroy at least one of the 2 undamaged carriers. This would then even the odds and make it 1 versus 1. And with that result, the prospect of a Japanese victory wouldn't be so far-fetched.
Dude, that's like saying, like in Tarkov, dude, you're like 1v5, a group of 5 people, and you're like, dude, think about it. If I just headshot 4 of them, then it's a 1v1, and it's not going to be that hard. It's like, what? What do you mean? Like, dude, what are you talking about?
En route to the target location, the air group sighted a carrier task force 30 miles away at 14:30. The carrier was not on fire, nor showed any indication that it was damaged. So clearly, this had to be one of the undamaged ones. Accordingly, Tomonaga settled on attacking this untouched force. However, unbeknownst to the Japanese, this was not a new carrier. It was the Yorktown again. American damage control had been superb, and following the dive bombing attack, the Yorktown's crew had been able to put out the fires and had restored enough of her boilers to bring her up to 19 knots. Thus, Hiryu's second attack was about to be spent on an injured carrier.
How?
Tomonaga approached from the carrier's port quarter. He decided on executing a standard split attack.
God damn, the
Radar
crew,
had detected
dude.
the incoming strike 45 miles out, but only 6 fighters were available. All 6 were sent to intercept, but only 2 found the enemy, shooting down a single torpedo bomber. By this point, the Yorktown had begun an evasive turn to starboard, giving Tomonaga a poor attack angle. In response, he divided his small force once again to conduct yet another anvil attack.
Was the other one an anvil attack?
The 4 planes were about to pass the outer ring of escorts when this picture was taken from the USS Pensacola. Note the heavy anti-aircraft fire that Tomonaga and his pilots had to fight through. The Americans would have to throw everything they could at this attack to save their carrier. Fortunately, they had one of their own best pilots on scene, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch. Having just taken off from the Yorktown, he was determined to repel this assault. Coming in at 200 feet and flying at 200 knots, Lieutenant Tomonaga steadied his aircraft to make his torpedo run. To his right, a Wildcat came roaring towards him. It was none other than Jimmy Thatch, and he delivered a devastating pass at Tomonaga's plane. The aircraft was badly damaged and set on fire. Nevertheless, with nerves of steel, Tomonaga pushed on and with impressive skills, still managed to launch his torpedo. His plane crashed shortly afterwards, killing him and his crew. Unfortunately for Tomonaga, his torpedo did not hit. His wingman also missed and was later shot down, and the other 2 of the group were also brought down with none of their torpedoes hitting their mark.
Oh no.
However, their sacrifice was not in vain, for it had lined up the Yorktown for the 2nd Division's attack. These 5 swooped in and scored 2 devastating hits on Yorktown's port side. In summary, Tomonaga's attack had cost the Japanese 5 torpedo bombers and 2 Zeros. The Americans had lost 4 fighters.
Wait, is the ship still going?
A photograph captured
Surely
the moment the
not,
torpedo
right?
struck.
Another
It was
20-minute
this attack
patch up? Yeah, another fucking 20-minute fucking patch job and they'll be back to moving.
that had dealt tremendous and decisive damage to the Yorktown. She lost all power, 3 of her boilers were knocked out, her rudder was jammed, and with water gushing in, a severe list developed. It seemed apparent that the carrier would capsize at any moment, which would have caused a heavy loss of life. So the captain ordered abandoned ship at 1500. The Yorktown was now definitely out of the fight. By 1545, Hiryu's surviving planes had landed. At this point, the Hiryu was exhausted. Mind you, they had been in constant action for the last 10 hours. Just 10 minutes after they landed, Nagumo received a report from his scout planes. It revealed the truth of Tomonaga's attack. The strike had hit the same carrier as before. So it was still 1 versus 2. With the odds still stacked against them, the Japanese finally decided it was time to retreat and open the range with the Americans. Yamaguchi looked at what remained of his strength, and it was pitiful. Only 4 bows and 5 cates remained. Incredibly, the admiral was still determined to attack the Americans. He would send a dusk attack with these 9 planes and then call it a day. But first, his exhausted men needed a respite from all the action. The men went in to eat and rest before launching their last counterstrike. However, the airmen would never get that chance. At this point, there's a distressing issue that has to be discussed. It's the controversial decision of Nagumo to close the range with the Americans once they had been discovered. After the 1030 disaster, Nagumo had been left with a single carrier, the Hiryu. The importance of this carrier cannot be overstated. Nagumo was in possession of an expensive military hardware that Japan could ill afford to lose. The Japanese had to fight intelligently from this point onwards. Early reports had indicated that the Americans were closing the gap and only 90 miles away. So fair enough, hopes for a surface engagement was justified. Therefore, Nagumo's decision to charge northeast to close the distance was reasonable. But there is something wrong with this picture. It's this, the Hiryu tagging behind Nagumo's surface force. A carrier has no business in a surface engagement. Not only that, but closing the distance keeps you within the enemy's strike range, and this was absurd. So why are they doing this? Why is the Hiryu still closing the distance with the Americans? Well, we don't really know. Maybe Nagumo believed the Americans were also seeking a surface engagement? But by 1240, this was shown to be highly unlikely based on the Americans changing course to the east, away from him. So what it seems like is that after 1030, the Japanese became short-sighted and got this type of tunnel vision where they were just focused on one thing, destroying the enemy. For both Nagumo and Yamaguchi, this fight had become personal. They were so determined to exact revenge and so caught up in the heat of the moment that they forgot to employ their assets carefully. Also, cultural and societal norms may have begun to cloud their thinking. Japanese society places a lot of value on honor and fulfilling one's duty. And we can see this occurring.
Is this supposed to be like 45 degrees? Why are we showing this? Why are we showing this? Hold up. It says 45. I'm assuming that's degrees? Why are we showing like an informational like demonstrations on this shit? Why?
Places a lot of value on honor and fulfilling one's duty. And we can see this occurring throughout World War II, with many soldiers ending their own lives rather than being taken prisoner, which was seen as a shameful act. There's a popular Japanese phrase that says, "Please continue trying to do your best." In other words, at this moment, winning was optional, but trying your hardest was not. Even if the situation was hopeless and doomed, they had to show that they were at least trying to win.
Dude, I agree with this quote, but people take this shit like really in a really weird direction. Like what they mean is trying means you must like try or die trying. Like, dude, retreating is a fucking incredible strategy. We've gotten clapped by retreating so many times. Like, retreating is an amazing strategy, but like, whatever, I guess.
But by doing so, they lost sight of the bigger picture. Saving this last precious carrier could have so well aided the Japanese in future operations. Both are to blame for this imprudent decision. It seems as if both were more concerned with preserving their personal honor instead of focusing on preserving this invaluable and irreplaceable carrier of their nation.
Selfish to not retreat?
Admittedly, you're striking back at the enemy had made good sense.
RNG.
But exposing your carrier to American air attack had not. So what they should have done is that they should have let the surface units close the gap, but not the carrier. They could have detached the Hiryu with an escort to the west and opened the range even before Tomonaga's force had taken off at 1330. Her aircraft still had the range to strike the Yorktown and make it back home. But instead, the Hiryu spent all afternoon closing the gap with the enemy. Only at 1550, when reports confirmed that the Hiryu was still facing 2 operational carriers, did she head northwest. But by this point, it was too little, too late. The consequence for their reckless decision had already caught up to them. The Americans had lost contact with the enemy after the 1030 attack. They didn't know where the Hiryu was, so at 1133, the Yorktown began sending out search planes to regain contact with the enemy. One of these planes had already reached the search limit, but the pilot decided to push just a little further. At 1430, his perseverance paid off when on his return leg, he came across the Hiryu. It was only 130 miles away from Task Force 16, well within strike range. If the Kido Butai had turned northwest immediately after launching Tomonaga's strike at 1330, the Hiryu would have been 35 miles further west at 1430, and chances are she would have never been spotted.
Oh no.
So much for saving your last precious carrier.
Dude, hey, listen. Hey, listen, dude. Hey, start throwing around that wheel, bro.
Once the Americans received the sighting report...
Let's see some evasive maneuvers, homie. Start throwing that bitch around, dude. You gotta dodge well.
A strike was immediately sent. The first wave was a mixed bag of Enterprise dive bombers with Yorktown survivors, followed by the Hornet, who launched her own strike 30 minutes later. At 1645, the first group sighted the Hiryu. The dive bombers swung around to the southwest so that they could approach with the sun to their backs. The 2 squadrons decided to concentrate on a ship apiece. The Yorktown bombers, much to their resentment, were selected to go for a battleship, while the 10 Enterprise dive bombers got the main prize of taking out the carrier. 13 fighters were on combat air patrol. These pilots were no doubt fatigued at this point, and the clever tactic of approaching out of the sun must have worked, because for the second time this day, the Japanese were caught by surprise. They didn't spot the Americans until they were practically on top of them. And this perhaps highlights the Japanese's greatest weakness in carrier warfare, their lack of radar.
What? They didn't have radar at all?
The Enterprise dive bombers began their attack at 1705. The carrier made a hard turn to port. This threw off their aim and resulted in the first few bombs missing their mark. Thankfully for the Americans, the planes from the Yorktown saw this and diverted. Hiryu's time had come. Dive bombers were able to land a devastating total of 4 hits, all on the forward part of the Hiryu. The powerful explosions ripped the forward deck apart. Although the Hiryu hadn't been as packed with fueled-up and armed aircraft like her 3 sisters, 4 bombs were enough to shatter this lightly armed carrier. Flight operations were out of order for the Hiryu.
Nah, it's over.
The remaining Dauntlesses went for the battleship but missed. 15 minutes later came Hornet's group. They ignored the Hiryu, seeing that she was doomed, and went for the cruisers, but to no avail. No hits were scored. In total, the Americans lost only 3 aircraft in the attack. All 4 carriers were now out of operation.
F.
Incredibly, Yamamoto still believed he could grasp victory from the jaws of defeat.
Dude, copium, bro.
He still entertained the prospect that Midway could be taken and that the American force could be destroyed in a surface battle. At 1915, Admiral Kurita and his cruiser squadron were ordered to bombard and neutralize Midway. The only hope left now for a victory was for a night action between Yamamoto's battleships and heavy cruisers and the American force of carriers and cruisers. Nagumo, who had been viewed as being too passive, was relieved of his command, and Admiral Kondo was left in charge for the upcoming night battle. However, by 2330, no contact had been made, and it was obvious that no surface engagement was forthcoming. If he continued east, he would place his ships in a vulnerable situation the following morning against American air attack.
Well, was that too passive? I think that, yeah, actually, that's a good question. How is that too passive? Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, something I want to know, like, for any of the naval people in chat, why the fuck was this carrier group a trillion miles away from any of the support groups? Why the fuck did that happen?
So reality finally began to sink in, and shortly after midnight, he cancelled the bombardment of Midway and ordered Kurita to change course to the northwest and join up with the main body. Soon, orders for a general retirement of all his forces were sent, and at 0255, Yamamoto officially cancelled the Midway operation.
The scuttling. Oh no.
Back to the scene of devastation. The Japanese carriers had been caught in the most vulnerable state possible, with fueled-up and armed aircraft on board. As mentioned, each bomb hit was made worse by the secondary explosions that took part inside the hangars. The fires were fed and nourished by the fueled-up strike planes, the bombs and torpedoes that hadn't been stored away safely, the fuel in the fuel lines, and other flammable materials found throughout the ship. And efforts to fight the fire successfully were hampered by many reasons. One was the poor design of the Japanese carriers, which made them ill-prepared to absorb damage and continue fighting. Second, fire hose and foam spraying systems were installed, but the water mains were damaged during the attack, rendering the systems inoperable.
Oh, unlucky.
And also, Japanese fire control abilities were simply subpar. So the fire steadily prevailed, and despite their best efforts, Japanese damage control equipment and training were simply not up to the task. The fires could not be extinguished, and this sealed the fate of the carriers. Soryu and Kaga were burning wrecks. After much deliberation, the decision was made to scuttle them. The Soryu sank at 1913 and lost 711 men. The Kaga sank at 1925. She lost the most personnel of all the carriers, losing 811 officers and men.
Oh, God.
There was a lot of hesitation with the Akagi, being that she was the flagship of the Kido Butai, but eventually she too was ordered to be scuttled. She sank the following morning, taking 267 souls with her. The Hiryu suffered the same fate. Fires had spread and could not be contained, and it was soon apparent that she was doomed. Admiral Yamaguchi, sticking true to the naval tradition, decided to go down with the ship. After a sentimental goodbye, Yamaguchi and a selected few stayed behind, while the rest of the crew transferred to a nearby destroyer.
I never understood this. Why would you just die? Why not, like your experience as a fucking officer is just completely wasted. My Discord, not yours. Like, I never understood this. Hey, all of the experience I just got from fighting this fucking battle in this combat, yeah, fuck all of that shit. And the whole reason I'm a fucking aircraft carrier fucking commander in the first place, fuck all of that experience because I want to die with this fucking ship? The fuck?
At 0510 on June 5th, she was also scuttled, struck by a single torpedo. But incredibly, she didn't go down until hours later in the morning. It was just enough time for a Japanese biplane to take this astonishing photo. Apparent is the gaping hole at the front of the ship.
Oh my God.
A portion of the elevator has been blown against the forward end of the island. Here's another classic shot of her, where we can see that the ship is still on fire amidships. The Hiryu sank some 2 hours after these photographs were taken at around 0915. 392 men were lost. The decisive phase of the battle was over, yet clashes continued for the next 2 days, which led to the sinking of the Japanese cruiser Mikuma and the Yorktown. That's right, the stubborn carrier still hadn't sunk at this point. I'll begin with the cruiser action. If we recall, Admiral Kurita, in command of Cruiser Squadron 7, had been tasked with bombarding Midway. Yamamoto ordered this mission to be cancelled 20 minutes past midnight on June 5th. However, the order was delayed by almost 2 hours before it got to Kurita at 0230. By this time, he was only 50 miles away from Midway. Regardless, he commenced his retreat by changing course to the northwest. But during this, a submarine was spotted. Evasive maneuvers were ordered, and during the confusion, the cruiser Mogami collided with her sister ship, Mikuma.
Oh, how do you fuck that up?
Mogami had her bow smashed and was left behind since she had to limp back home at a slow speed. The Mikuma faithfully stayed alongside her as an escort. The rest of the day, they escaped air attacks by Midway-based bombers. But the next day, on June 6, they were bombed repeatedly, but this time from carrier-based aircraft of Task Force 16. 5 hits landed on Mogami, 5 on Mikuma, and 1 on a destroyer. Despite her collision damage and the hits, Mogami managed to escape, while ironically, it was the Mikuma that succumbed to her wounds. American pilots
Dude, you threw!
Pictures of the mortally wounded ship. The destruction of the Mikuma is clear. The ship sank at 1930 with a heavy loss of life, with as many as 700 of her crew unaccounted for. Retribution was obtained against the Americans. On June 4th, the Yorktown was abandoned, but despite appearing that she was about to capsize, she was found still afloat on the 5th. With the battle practically won and the Japanese in retreat, the idea of getting back to her and towing her to port seemed like a real possibility. So the next day, on June 6, the destroyer Hammond brought on board a salvage team. The destroyer remained moored next to the Yorktown to provide power. The team began to have progress. Power was restored, the list was corrected, and soon the Yorktown was being towed at 3 knots.
Oh my god!
But lurking in the waters was submarine I-168.
Oh no.
She had been dispatched by Yamamoto to finish off the Yorktown. The submarine skillfully approached, unnoticed, and patiently waited for the perfect shot. Although 5 destroyers were on patrol, no one spotted the submarine.
Oh no.
She closed in and at 1,500 meters released 4 torpedoes.
It's over,
The first
right?
hit the Hammond, which split the ship in half, and the second and third hit the Yorktown. The carrier was done for, and the salvage team evacuated the ship. The following pictures tell the story. The Hammond is shown sinking here after breaking in half.
Dude,
as she was
these
going on
photos are crazy!
under, her depth charges exploded, killing more of her survivors nearby in the water. 84 of her crew went down with her. Even with 4 torpedo wounds, the Yorktown still took a while to sink, and before she did, she rode on her back, revealing the gaping torpedo wounds from the submarine attack. On June 7th, the distinguished ship, the ship that had played such a pivotal role in Coral Sea and Midway, finally slipped beneath the waters at 0500. 57 men were lost.
Damn, could you imagine if that ship survived? That would be such a great museum piece.
So now we can go to the final losses
do they fit ships that big in a museum? Like, that's a fucking massive ship, right? You couldn't, right? It'd have to be, like, in a hangar or some shit, right?
battle. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 cruiser, and 250 aircraft.
Yeah.
But
At
they
a
didn't have a
dockyard.
heavy loss in pilots. Only 121 airmen were lost that day. What they truly lost were the 4 irreplaceable
where I
carriers
live?
and the experienced and highly skilled aircraft mechanics and technicians on board them. These men were difficult to replace. By best estimates, Japan lost 3,057 men. For the Americans, the cost had been relatively small for what they had accomplished. They had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 144 planes. Total losses in men, 362.
Oh my god!
There was no question about
Ratios,
it.
plus
The
you fell
Battle
off.
of Midway had been a decisive American victory.